You're listening to Turning World, a podcast exploring a changing and unravelling world with curious, open and intelligent conversations across politics, culture, faith and beyond, with myself, John Egan.
And Keith Hitchman. And welcome to Zia Chaudry, our guest.
Thank you very much.
Zia, MBE, Scouser, maybe that should have been first. Criminal lawyer, barrister of many years, standing. Deputy Lord Lieutenant of Liverpool, still holding that role?
Still there.
Still there. And Just Your Average Muslim, which is the title of a book you wrote how long ago now?
Over 10 years now.
Right, okay.
Maybe 12 or 13 years.
Still selling well, or?
Well, I've realised that unless you're writing about boy wizards, you're not going to make any money out of books.
Right.
So I don't know. I think it's trickling along nicely, but it was more to get a platform really than to generate huge sales.
Yeah.
So I've still got the platform.
Well, I read it back in the day, and I've interviewed you on it before for Bay TV, which has got to be over 10 years ago now, when we first met, I think. But I'm going to ask you the same question for the benefit of this podcast, which is, who is the average Muslim, and what defines the average Muslim? Is there such a? Can we say this?
Probably not, but I think the whole point of naming the book in such a way was to ask the question, what is the average Muslim, and then to attempt to answer it. And of course the answer is there are all sorts of different Muslims, or in different fields, at different ends of the spectrum of conservative, liberal, but the point is that when we were discussing Muslims, it was always moderate or extremist.
Okay.
And so I was saying, well, is that really the only way of defining these people? What do they actually do? And so that's why I called it Just Your Average Muslim. Now, looking back on it, I think, well, what I meant at the time, it's probably changed in the decades since.
Yeah, and feedback, what kind of feedback did you get from it originally? Positive, negative?
Very positive, overwhelmingly positive.
Yeah.
Because it was providing this almost human face to a phenomenon that we were only familiar with through the media. And so if the media said somebody was a good Muslim, well, he's a good Muslim. And if they said he was an extremist, he was an extremist. But that's all that we really knew about them. And then somebody comes along and says, well, I was born in Burnley in 1969, and I found my way to Liverpool in this way, and this is what my family was like, and this is the school I went to. And suddenly you see the human behind the title Muslim. And the idea, of course, was to get to that human point that, look, funnily enough, our concerns are the same as everybody else's concerns. So we want, our kids to be healthy and do well. And, the test is often the Muslim, the mother at the school gates. And what are the concerns of the Muslim mother as opposed to the atheist mother or the Christian mother? And you'll find that they've got the same concerns.
Yeah. So you just touched on the changing, or the developing sort of context that we're living in the Western world and in this country. So things have changed, haven't they? Quite a lot since you wrote the book. Yes. The context has changed. And when we think about Islamophobia, back then, Islamophobia was at least thought to be confined to the margins of the kind of maybe the far right. Now it appears to have become much more of a mainstream kind of issue, and as being embraced by, one could argue, I'm sure people would argue against me, being embraced by mainstream parties that are holding, riding high in the opinion polls. How are you addressing that yourself, or?
I mean, it's become very uncomfortable, and one of the concerns I had when I wrote the book was that, look, when I was growing up, my parents were immigrants, and I knew I was the son of immigrants. So you expected a degree of discomfort. At home we spoke a different language, we ate different food, and, my mum wore different clothes. And so you thought, well, we are different. But you thought over time that's going to improve, because then when my children are born, they're going to be very much, products of this country. They're not going to be thinking our parents are immigrants because their parents weren't immigrants.
Yeah.
And so this is it's a natural process, and you look at other immigrant communities, and I'm sure they've all experienced the same, and things will get better. So that was the thinking at the time. But I was concerned that even then, it was starting to get a little bit uncomfortable. There was starting to be discussions about, for example, Muslims, do they really fit in to Europe? And I'm thinking, well, if we're discussing this now, then how comfortable is it going to be for my kids who are going to think, well, hang on, we were born here. Why are we any different? And so that's one of the reasons why I started to write the book, to address those issues and to give them, really primarily my children, an insight into what it was like growing up for me, and hopefully they'll learn some lessons from it. But as you rightly point out, since then, things have become more uncomfortable. And now here we are a decade later, and I think it was Saeed Awasi who said it a few years ago. He said something about, Islamophobia, passing the dinner table test, some sort of phrase along those lines, where it was perfectly normal to talk about Islam and Muslims in a quite derogatory way and other them in that way. And I remember and this was going back probably about a decade, I was asked to deliver a day-long course about Islam, and it was to a group of religious studies teachers, and it was organised by the Catholic community. And I went along, and they said, we're very open to this, we're very receptive, and we want to learn more. And, so we have these regular sessions, and so we have, for example, Judaism, because it's so closely aligned to Christianity. And then we have Islam, Sikhism, Hinduism, Buddhism. And that made me think that you really don't have any idea.
I wonder what the common denominator there is, because it seems to be more focused around ethnicity than faith, doesn't it?
It certainly seemed to be, but I thought, if you just scratch beneath the surface, surely you can see that there are the Abrahamic faiths on the one hand, and they're generally grouped together. But the fact that you've put Islam with the others shows how, what your approach is. And I guess
or ignorance.
Ignorance, yeah. And it was a sort of benign ignorance, but it was worrying because these are teachers. They weren't sort of...
And these were Catholic teachers.
Catholic teachers.
It's interesting. I mean, Rory Stewart recently has been talked about how the far right is using this phrase Judeo-Christian tradition in order to define what's authentically British, what's kind of indigenous and part of who we are, and by implication, what's other and not part of who we are. And it's quite an insidious distinction that's made.
Absolutely. And you hear Jewish people themselves, and I've heard Jewish people say, there's a rabbi who was quite prominent on social media a while back, and she was American, and she was saying it's a scam. Because there's what's the Judeo-Christian tradition? This is used deliberately to other Muslims. And so that made me start to think about it. And you think, okay, Judeo-Christian, just let's go through the history of Judeo-Christian. Which countries were the Jews thrown out of? Was it Muslim countries or the Christian countries? What does Judaism say about Jesus Christ as compared to what does Islam say about Jesus Christ? So where are what's the commonality? And specifically in Islam, in the Quran, it does refer to the commonalities, but this contrived commonality between Jewish faith and Christian was designed, as far as I was concerned, to keep the Muslims to one.
It's also a common parlance amongst people who basically don't go to church anyway. Yeah. So their credentials as Christians is one of pragmatic convenience rather than any form of faith commitment.
Yeah, when Tommy Robinson and others use the phrase Judeo-Christian, they know nothing about Judeo or Christian, and there they are bandying this phrase around.
Yeah, and it's the other end of the extreme, isn't it? I mean, you make the point. It was at one point, Keith. It was people on the margins. But I think the really scary thing, and talking to Muslim friends, the thing that I think really they find, completely disorientating, is when, people who are regarded as being kind of almost like national treasures, people like John Cleese, a comedy actor who's still a prominent public figure, who's wheeled out as being a great fellow, can spend most of his days, now that he's no longer getting gigs as a comedian or a comedy writer, just spouting out nonsense about Sharia law or whatever it is, or not being allowed to walk his dog. And it's like, where does this come from? It's fantasy.
It is fantasy, but it's worrying.
Yeah,
because like you say, if you've got mainstream characters like that who are everybody is familiar with them and feels that what's the word when you think they're inoffensive, they're just nice people. He's a nice old man, and what could he possibly say that's untoward? And whatever he does say, it's common sense. It's coming from a good place, and all these assumptions that we make about certain people. And I often say that you can. If you caricature people, you've got the Muslim leader in his military uniform who's obviously a dictator and therefore up to no good. You can have somebody who's white and Western and wearing a suit who could be responsible for the death of millions, but because of the way he comes across, he will inevitably be regarded in more favourable light by us than the guy with the military uniform on.
You said you wrote the book in a sense, for your children, or perhaps for your children's generation. I mean, your children would be older now,
Yes.
in their 20s, are they? Or
Yeah, one's in the 20s, the other are late teens.
so
yes.
right. How are they coping? I mean, how different is it for them?
I've always said that, in a sense, I'm the wrong person to look at, and my family's probably the wrong family to look at, because professional middle class background, go to good schools, got good friends, we've got good neighbours, and it's a nice setup. The people probably to ask that question of are the ones who encounter, the racism and the hate daily. So your taxi drivers, your Uber drivers, those people who work in the late night economy, in takeaways and the like. Those people who live on estates that are a little bit problematic and have more crime around them. They're probably the ones who are bearing the brunt of it. My kids, as I say, they go to a good school, they're surrounded by good friends, good people, and so on. At the moment, they're fine. But one of the concerns is tomorrow when they apply for jobs, and they've got Muslim names applying, and there was that study, wasn't there, done where they had job applications made in the name of Muhammad, and exactly the same credentials then, but with a different name. A white English name was put forward, and the amount of rejections that the Muslim name got in comparison to the non-Muslim name was worrying. So I do think that the one thing that my kids can't escape is the colour of their skin, their names, their religion. And so when they start to, when they become adults and they have to navigate that adult world of job applications and the like, then maybe it's going to be different for them. Maybe it's going to be harder for them. Already, and this is, we tend to be half a decade behind, don't we, with everything that America does. But America, in the last few years under Trump, has made it clear that diversity is a bad thing. And these EDI initiatives are all to be disbanded. Well, if they're doing that now, then what are we going to be doing 5 years down the line? And this goes back to the how Islamophobia has become okay now. Well, if you start to say things like diversity is a hindrance, and start to put that into the conversation, you're going to get a group of people, aren't you, who say that the reason I didn't get that job was because they gave it to the diversity candidate. And so you build this groundswell of opinion when
you're saying actually the opposite is true.
Exactly. But if the culture has become one of resistance to diversity, then when these kids grow up, they're going to find it difficult. And what does that then do? It marginalizes them even more, and all the things that we don't want them to be attracted to are going to become potentially more attractive. Well, if they don't like us anyway, why not stick to ourselves? And that was one of the things that I was very keen not to do. I grew up having mostly English friends, and I used to always laugh that at university for 3 years I lived with 7 white guys. All my Asian, Muslim friends were like, what are you doing? I was like, look, I went to school with mostly English lads.
It's a blue coat.
It was the blue coat, and in those days it was only boys, and 90% white. The school probably more, 95%. It's very different now. But I said, so for me to go and find some Asian or Muslim friends, that would be unnatural. So I'm hanging around with these guys because they're a good laugh. We get on well. Now, and so I was very comfortable in that. And then the environment that I went into in terms of work, it was a very white middle class inevitably environment. So I was comfortable around those people, and I always made a point therefore of saying that, look, if you want to be well regarded in the community, you have to be involved in the community. You can't be sitting on the sidelines and whinging about the media treats us badly or everybody's against us. You need to get involved. Now that was probably easier for me to do than it might be for my children, because if this culture does develop where they feel we're not really wanted, then it's going to be easier for them to be attracted to, their own kind. So
Have you any sense of where it's come from and how this has happened so rapidly to get to a position where not only are these views, tolerated on the margins, but they're being kind of, promulgated from the establishment, from the core, from the middle ground of politics. The Conservative Party now, I think, is probably, indistinguishable from Reform in terms of its fundamental ideology, and particularly its approach towards diversity and I think specifically towards the Muslim community, both in terms of domestic policy but also in terms of how it frames international affairs. Do you get any notion as to how this has happened, or was there a turning point? Was there an event? Was there something that's kind of traumatized British society to the point where it's kind of lost its marbles in that sense?
I think it's been a process. Ever since I was a young child, I remember seeing movies that painted Muslims negatively. Then at the time it was, most of it was American content, and it was because of the Middle East, and you kind of understood it. It was unpleasant, but it was not directly concerning Muslims in Britain, for example. But that was the culture that was developing, and that was the direction it was going in. So then I would say that what has happened is classic scapegoating, where you've then got to a stage where we are very much, I would say, as a country in decline, economic decline. And then you get 2008, the global financial crash. Well, we didn't emerge well out of that, but the rich didn't do too badly. And the bailouts, and this is what always made me laugh. Do poor people ever get bailed out? They're just left to their own devices, and we're told that, well, it's the market, and if the market says that your little corner shop is not deemed worthy of success, then this is how it works. You will fall by the wayside. But that didn't happen to the banks and those big institutions. They were given a shed load of money, which is actually taxpayer money. They were all bailed out, and the poor were left poorer, the rich were left much richer. So you had that, which I think was a trauma. But then how do you address that? And I think it's since then that the ramping up of Muslims as the scapegoat has really taken on.
That's a very similar historic scenario to what happened in Nazi Germany, isn't it? It's kind of economic collapse leading to a kind of political and moral collapse, and then the inevitable scapegoating. Who's responsible for this? Who do we blame for this? Who can we hold? Who carries the can for it?
It always makes me laugh that that cartoon, you'll have seen it, where they've got three people around the table and a pile of cookies in front of one who's the rich capitalist, and one cookie is in front of the single white person at the table who's facing an immigrant, and the guy with all the cookies is saying, you need to watch your cookie because that immigrant's got his eye on it. You're completely oblivious to the amount that he's amassed, and that's the situation that we're in now, and it's the rich, isn't it? That's the other thing, that the far right, they're funding. Where does it come from? It comes from billionaires, often American billionaires. And so this isn't some organic, that's the other thing that I'm very concerned about. It's not an organic process where people have just naturally become more Islamophobic. This is all...
It's planned.
It's planned.
Yeah.
It's planned. And, if you look at the social media accounts and the algorithm and the way that's manipulated, who is doing all that? Elon Musk, for a start. The world's richest man. No, he's not got no sympathies with the poor. And so he's one of these who's very much saying, you need to keep an eye on your one cookie because these immigrants are after it. And so this gets, just multiplied. And at the same time, we're in a culture where we're encouraged. This morning I went to the library with my daughter for the first time in years. We just thought it'd be nice to go to the library.
Yeah,
peaceful. And it was empty. And it made me think, well, it's empty. Even though it's the school holidays, it's empty because we're all distracted by our phones. We're all on there. We're scrolling on there. And this idea of going to somewhere peaceful where you can sit and read and contemplate and actually think, that's something that we've not been encouraged to do. And even as adults, your job is to watch Strictly and Bake Off and all that. You can vote, Vote on Bake Off. Don't worry about voting for anything more important. And so if we're being marginalised as a community, then inevitably when it comes to, the big issues, then we're going to want the easy answers. We're not going to go and read something and think about it.
We're being marginalised intellectually, aren't we?
Yes.
By technology.
Yeah.
And social media.
And again, it's not the technology, it's the ones who are, pulling the strings. And, those people who own the big social media companies, they, as I say, they don't have sympathy with the...
Yeah. I think the technology itself is alienating. It's not simply that, well, if there were some nice people running large tech companies and they were doing it with the best intentions and they were, being benevolent and philanthropic and tolerant, it would all be nice and it would all be leading to human, happiness and bliss. I think the technology itself, embedded in the technology, it's driven by a political and economic imperative, and the political and economic environment in which it evolves kind of gives it its character, and it is atomizing, it is individualistic, it is basically addressing people's sense of who they are as individuals and disconnecting them from social context.
Their base nature as well.
Yeah, and their base nature, absolutely.
And everything nowadays gets monetized, doesn't it?
Yeah.
So unless you are going to make money out of it, it can't be a worthwhile pursuit.
So just coming back to the context again, what do you make of the fact that Reform UK is chaired by a fellow Muslim, also called Zia?
Also called Zia. Yeah, and I found out the other days actually. Sorry.
And other Muslims who've placed themselves maybe in a softer way in perhaps in the Conservative Party, or what's your take on that?
I mean, for somebody like me, it can be quite depressing on the one hand, but on the other hand, you think, well, it's also a reflection that we don't all think the same,
right?
And amongst our number, we're going to have the multimillionaires and the poor. And so to expect them all to think the same is probably unrealistic.
Yeah.
And so I don't have to agree with them, but what they do show is actually we occupy that political spectrum in the same way as everybody else does.
Yeah, interesting. Yeah.
And you could then have, I suppose once you start to investigate it, it's probably a useful exercise to see, because I've always said this about mainstream politics anyway, that if you get to the top, you've made some compromises along the way.
Yeah.
And, so it's only a certain kind of politician who makes it that far. And once you've made it that far, so when, for example, we're at home and we're talking about, that leader should be doing something differently, why do you expect that when, if you stop and think about it, he's made so many compromises along the way that by the time he's got there, he's no longer...
I mean, that's true of any institution.
It's true
of
any institution.
Yeah,
exactly. So the same with politicians, you've got those who have been weeded out along the way, who probably would have, had different views. But yeah, you can have your different views, but you can sit on the back benches, you can have them from there at best, but don't expect to be occupying the top table. And as you said, that applies to all communities across the spectrum. So maybe there's, and maybe the starker example is America at the moment, where, their politics is just so polluted that now this, you've got people who are saying that, why are we just so beholden to particular lobbies, and how healthy is that for our democracy? And if they're starting to ask those questions now, and already you've got politicians, interestingly, in America now, who are making a point now of saying, I do not accept money from this particular lobby. So now suddenly it's become, in their views, advantageous to distance yourself from the lobbies, whereas before it was almost, accepted that you had to be accepting money from them. That was the only way to success. So now that there's some resistance, that maybe there's, an alternative.
I just going back to Zia, your near namesake in Reform. It's just so incongruous in that, the recent announcement, and obviously this is very dear to your heart, Keith, as a vicar, that redundant churches. And this is fascinating. This fascinates me, that this great Judeo-Christian culture of ours is like the churches are virtually empty, but to such an extent that the Christian denominations are selling them off. and to say, oh gosh, right, okay, so what we're going to do to defend our Christian culture is we're going to bring in some bizarre law to prevent churches being turned into mosques. They can become a carpet warehouse. They can become a supermarket. They can be a nightclub, a restaurant. They can be knocked down. But God forbid, literally, that they should become a mosque.
Yeah, and it's 0.9%, I think.
Yeah.
0.09% of churches that are repurposed become mosques. Right. So it's not even an issue. It's just not an. It's.
Well, as with anything, they'll blow it out of proportion and give the impression that this is. I mean, the phrase that was used recently was domination. When Muslims were praying in Trafalgar Square, And I think it was the Prime Minister who said that, look, Christians celebrated in Trafalgar Square, Jews have celebrated Hanukkah in Trafalgar Square, Hindus have celebrated Diwali in Trafalgar Square. Why have you got an issue with Muslims?
Well, I know that the Muslim community in Liverpool at Al Rama Mosque were concerned that just the sheer numbers of worshippers during Ramadan was such that they were concerned that it was going to generate some kind of local community opposition, and there was, and the far right were posting pictures of large numbers of Muslims in the street. My God, and using that to kind of create this sense that look how many of them there are. They're dominating our street. It's scary.
The way it's depicted, you're right, it is scary. Having said that, and I'll be frank, I think Muslims could do things a lot better.
Yeah.
This idea that we are just victims and everyone's out to get us doesn't help us. It's not good for society, but it's also it's not entirely accurate, because there are times when we have this every week when I go to the mosque with my kids, with my sons, and I'm saying to them that why can't we park properly? It's basic stuff. If I was a non-Muslim and I saw the way we parked, I'd be livid. It's got nothing to do with race. It's just being inconsiderate. Now, if as a Muslim you're inconsiderate, it's worse, because our whole point is that you're supposed to be good, you're supposed to be doing the right thing, you're supposed to be helpful. And yet, when it comes to things like prayers, it's almost like we're blinkered. I've got to get to the mosque. I can dump my car anywhere. And it takes the mosque leaders to say, can such and such a car, can the driver move that car, please, because you're blocking somebody's driveway?
Well, I mean, I have that problem outside my church, actually, on Sunday, so...
Right.
It's an average problem. And,
you surprised me, Keith.
Yeah.
They're coming from miles.
Yeah, maybe not so many cars, perhaps, but they do park badly.
But that's a small issue.
Yeah,
but does it... Is there a bigger issue there? Are there things that the community could and should be doing to essentially just kind of to deal with hostility in a creative and positive way, rather than accepting a kind of marginalised victim role? Because the temptation would be, if you feel that you're being made to feel as if you're an alien presence, that you're other, that you don't belong, that you're a separate nation, that you don't integrate, that there's something irredeemably isolating about your identity, then it's not surprising if people kind of live up to that. They'll want to stick together in order to have some sense of belonging, have some sense of security, I guess. But that's a temptation that might be counterproductive. And how do you counter that? What can the community do to be more to effectively assert themselves, saying, no, we are integral to British identity, we're integral to British society, we're here to stay, and we're playing a positive role, and that is benefiting everybody by us being here. How can that sort of point be made? It's not easy.
It's not easy, and I'm very critical of mosque leaders, and always have been. But then, more recently, I've thought to myself, to be fair to them, if you're, because I'd listen to the sermon on a Friday and think, well, you've got a captive audience of 3,000 people here, and I'd have done a better job if you'd just given me the microphone, and you're the leader, and therefore, in my eyes, you've not done a decent job. But then I think to myself, yeah, but those 3,000 people include in their number your barristers and your doctors who were born here, and refugees who arrived a few months ago. how do you give a sermon?
Yeah.
That,
Yeah.
and so what they do is they play it safe. They'll just go through and this is what this aspect of our religion means, and we should. So they don't actually apply it to our life, because everyone's lives are so disparate. So what they just do is say that in Islam it says that you should do this, that, and the other. And you think, well, okay, I can kind of get where he's coming from now, given the nature of the audience. But to answer your question, what do we do about it? It's partly for that reason, it's very challenging. But everybody, I think, has still got a role to play. So if you are able to string a sentence together, well, maybe that's what you should be focusing on. Maybe there's more of an onus on you to engage with the wider community, because they'll have their concerns, but they're not going to raise them with you. So maybe you need to find the opportunities and say, you know what you've seen on the telly? Well, that might not be entirely accurate. Let's have a conversation. What are your concerns? Or let's see what the areas of commonality are. So there's a greater onus on that person. But the guy who hasn't got that, within him, you can't expect that of him. But that's where I would, if I was the delivering the sermon, I'd be saying, okay, fine, you can't engage with the media, you can't engage with the wider community, but you can park your car properly. You can be mindful of the impact of your behavior on your neighbors, on those people who are walking past the mosque today. And it's when you switch off and think, well, I'm doing my thing and I don't care about anybody else. That's un-Islamic. That's never been Islam. And there are plenty of examples from the Prophet's time where he said, we're not going to do this because it's going to upset the people that we live with. And there was an example, I think it was the second caliph, and he went to, I think it was Damascus, to a church there, and it was a prayer time. He wanted to pray there, and he made a point of praying outside the church. He could have allowed him to pray inside, but he said no, because if I pray inside, it sets a precedent, and people are going to think that Muslims are going to think they're entitled to pray inside because the leader prayed inside, and this is your church, and thank you very much for the offer, but I'll pray outside. Why? Because he was concerned about relationships with other people, the perceptions, and this kind of thinking, I think is too often conspicuous by its absence in our communities.
I mean, Adam Kelwick is just the past master at that stuff, isn't he? And but when I look at what Adam puts out, on social media, is he alone in that, or we just don't see a lot of that? I don't see a lot of that other than coming from Adam, actually. It may be because I know Adam and it's Liverpool, and so I'm more familiar with it. But is there a countrywide strategy to do that kind of thing?
Keith, if you knew anything about Muslims, you'd know we don't do strategy.
Right.
Long-term thinking is not part of our agenda. I can assure you of that. No, there's no strategy, and partly because we don't have the hierarchy that the church has, for example, where you can feed down and this is what everybody needs to do. We don't have that, which sometimes is an advantage, but sometimes is a disadvantage. If you're living in an organised, structured society, you've got no organisation and structure, you're going to not perform as well as you could. So partly it's the lack of thinking. Partly it's because I think the other thing that Adam's very good at is he's of that generation that's kind of mastered social media and understood the importance of it, and so he's done that very well, and he does a lot of good work. That's the other thing, he's got a lot that he can talk about. People like me are probably too old for that now, so I might have the right ideas, but in terms of implementing them, I'd probably not be as good as the youngsters. Having said that, though, there's a group, you may have come across them, Scouse Muslims.
No,
sounds interesting.
And they're very on it when it comes to the social media side of things, and so the good work they do, and they engage with people, and they do a lot of good stuff, but they back it up with a sort of commensurate social media presence as well. There's a friend of mine who runs a charity called the Liverpool Muslim Outreach Society, and every Saturday they are out at various refugee centres, feeding people, literally providing them with food. And he's great at that, but he's my age. He's not so great at the social media side of stuff in terms of promoting that. I think he could be a lot better. Whereas these youngsters, they're doing that kind of work as well, but then making sure that it's amplified. So it's understanding how society works. It's understanding that you can't just do good stuff. You have to let people see that you're doing good stuff, because the other side, the ones who are, you know, the far right, they're going to make sure their voice gets amplified. And we might recall an example from a few years ago when there were floods in the Lake District, and these Muslims came up from London, you know, and it was around about Christmas time, and they had like vans full of toys for the kids because it was Christmas. And I was saying to my wife, I said, you know what, that, you know, was because they wanted to do good, and the mainstream media were attracted to it because it was a fantastic story. Yeah. So they didn't have to go and look for the media came to them. So if you do certain things,
they're counterintuitive. They cannot just deconstruct those stereotypical perceptions.
And I said that the impact of that on, you know, people who are sitting in their homes thinking, oh, these Muslims are this, that and the other, and suddenly they pull up with vans and they're helping out, that's what really impacts people.
And that's a real thing because it comes from the heart. That
I
mean, they weren't doing it in order to for the mainstream media. No. They were doing it because that was part of their, you know, of their Islamic, the outworking of their Muslim faith.
Yeah. The same at on Christmas Day this year at the mosque. They opened up to provide food for homeless people and anybody who was hungry, anybody who was lonely, and the vast majority of people that went weren't Muslims.
Yeah. Oh, was that the Abdullah Quilliam Mosque?
Yeah. No, at Al Rahma.
Al Rahma, because I know Abdullah Quilliam Mosque, they made a point of it because, you know, the whole story, and that's a fascinating chapter of history as well, that an English Scouse Muslim in the 19th century, English Scouse solicitor in the 19th century became a Muslim, set up this, what was turned out to be the first mosque in the country, in Brougham Terrace. But then one of the things he did was, at Christmas, he'd say, right, we're going to feed the poor in the area, because not everybody is going to have a nice Christmas meal. And so he was very much about the impact you make with your local community, regardless of their faith. And the mosque now has kind of picked up on that tradition that this is something that, you know, is incumbent upon us to do. So there's that kind of stuff. And there's, you know, there are good stories, but they just don't get the publicity. I remember a few years ago, this was before I wrote the book, but so I included it in the book, that's why I remember it. There was a story of a synagogue in Bradford that was in disrepair and was in danger of closing down. And it was the Muslims who said, no, we're not having this closing down. And they then put money into it, and they helped to, you know, renovate it and ensure that it stayed open. And so you think that kind of story, you know, if people realise that, you know, Muslims are not insular, they don't just keep themselves to themselves, they do engage with the community. But it's a two-way process. So you've got to be receptive. And I remember years ago, my brother-in-law lives up in Lancashire, and I remember at the time I was quite condescending in the observation I made. And I said that, look, you know, in my street there's 16 houses, and at Christmas I get Christmas cards off 8 of them. That's half the street sending me a Christmas card, and you guys don't even get involved with your neighbours, and, you know, you need to do better. And his answer to me was, don't you think we tried? Don't you think my dad wanted to move out of, you know, the ghetto and into the nice areas? And what do you think happened when we moved there? People put the houses up for sale and said, oh, the neighbourhood's going down now because they're moving in. And so when you then think that you're not welcomed, you stick to your own. So when you've got the money, you'll buy next door rather than going out into the nice areas. And that's what's happened in a lot of these areas in the Lancashire mill towns. And so I always say, well, it's a two-way process, isn't it? We have definitely got to engage more, no doubt about that. And I would say the onus is on us. But at the same time, you know, there's only so many times you can be rejected and still carry on making that effort.
It's about a conversation as well, isn't it? I mean, that's the other thing that Adam's really good at.
Yes,
is you know, fostering the conversation and crossing those divides. You know, that I mean, he doesn't just go to the people that want to talk to him. He goes to the people who don't want to talk to him. And so I kind of think we need, you know, across all the faith traditions and between people who are not of faith, we just need to have more conversations, because when you come together and you meet people, I mean, even like we're doing now, you just get more understanding, and you kind of realise actually that, you know, maybe it's not just the average Muslim, but just the average person.
Yes.
You know, so more conversations.
Definitely. I mean, I think Adam's Adam's exceptional, because I remember when he did reach out to certain people in the last couple of years, and I thought I wouldn't be doing that. I pride myself on being very open and amenable to conversation, but I thought I would not be doing that. But he was, no, come to the mosque tomorrow. Let's have a chat.
And he made it work.
He made it work.
Oh, yeah.
He made it work. Those people went away with a completely different view. And so, he's exceptional. And he's good at creating that space. And I think that's maybe where society and those who are, in charge should think more about, well, how do we, if they want to, how do we create these conversation spaces? And this is, one of the concerns, that is there a will to do it?
I think the kind of signals from politics suggest that there isn't, because if there was a sense that we've got to heal potentially, damaging social schisms that exist, particularly this one about Islamophobia, there would be that sort of curating that kind of conversation at a kind of national and certain regional level. There would be more concerted effort being made to foster dialogue and a sense of unity. But it's deeply depressing that directly after the Gorton and Denton by-election, our esteemed former Prime Minister Tony Blair talked about this unholy alliance between the left and Islamists, as if, delegitimizing Muslims from even voting. Yeah. That, how dare they? How dare they go out and vote and actually vote in a way that determines the outcome of an election? That there was something intrinsically wrong in people participating in civic democracy. And it just seems to me that there are too many votes out there for mainstream politicians, even the Labour Party, unfortunately, today, to be able to make those kind of positive, inclusive soundings, because they would be in danger, or they would be advised by their pollsters, they're in danger of antagonising the voters who've already defected to reform or thinking about defecting to reform. And they're imprisoned by that.
But I think, again, I would say that we're, in this country, we're a little bit behind, and Tony Blair, I think, was a little bit behind the times with what's actually going on, because traditionally it's been, leftist and, Islamist, put them together, and that's an unholy alliance. Well, okay. But if you look in America now, if you look at certain conservatives in America and what they're coming out and saying, actually they've got beyond that now.
It's not the only unholy alliance. Yeah.
And so, and this blame it all on the left. Well, now that suddenly they're starting to raise certain things that maybe we'll be discussing and conservatives will be discussing in a few years, because in many respects, many Muslims are very socially conservative.
Yeah. Yeah.
And there are some, there's certain things they have in common with conservatives, and certain things that they have very much, they don't have in common with the left. And yet that's never been, I don't think, explored in this country in the way that it's being explored now in America.
Well, that's interesting. A few years ago, I was in Woking, which is in Surrey.
You went to Pizza Express, weren't you?
I did actually go to. It was before the actual event, but I actually did go to.
Do you remember it well?
I was in Woking. My wife was working there, and I went to
working at Woking
and had some sort of time to kill. And I was. I found myself in there was a general election. It was just before a general election, and I found myself in the Muslim kind of part of town, and I was actually given. It was Surrey, obviously, but I was surprised by the amount of conservative posters in and it was a very heavily Islamic part of town in terms of the demographic. So again, that's another stereotype, isn't it? That kind of.
It is. And hitherto, I think the Conservatives have been happy to throw the Muslims under the bus on the basis that they're not going to vote for us anyway. But I think that's it's a mistake, because as immigrant communities settle, inevitably you're going to get those who are successful, entrepreneurial, make some money, don't want to be paying as much in tax as others might want them to, and so you're going to get that group of people. And I think they dismiss them too readily, which is a mistake. But no doubt they'll learn from what's happening across the pond.
It's certainly happened with the Indian Hindu population, hasn't it? That if you were to look now, I guess, I've not seen any kind of poll evidence, but judging simply by the number of prominent conservative politicians who come from with that particular immigrant community, they are now voting primarily in the terms of economic self-interest rather than a historic antagonism or distrust of the Conservatives because of their views
and they
on
could have
immigration.
tapped into that in the same way with the Muslim community, but they chose not to.
Yeah.
And in fact, we probably remember the mayoral election in London when it was Goldsmith who was saying that, you know, if Sadiq Khan comes in, then this is what's going to happen, and he was courting the Hindu vote in a very blatant and quite frankly racist way.
Well, the Reform candidate's doing that right now.
Yeah. And so that's a worry, but that's at the voting end of the spectrum. But I think that if going back to the question of is there really a will to address this disconnect between communities, I always go back to, well, where does it start? It starts in schools, doesn't it? It starts at a young age, and surely that's where we can be performing a lot better. And it takes me back to, I remember more than a decade ago, I was in Brussels and had a meeting with the British Council there, and in fact this was 2007-8, and it was at a time when there was concern about Muslims and extremists in Britain and that sort of thing. And the British Council was saying to me, oh well, we're putting out this document, this book that we've got here. It's called, I think it was called Our Shared Future, and it highlights all the Muslim contributions to Europe throughout history, and we're taking it all around schools in Europe. And I said, that's fantastic. This meeting was in Brussels. I said, that's really good. Ever thought about doing it in Britain? I mean, it's all very well educating the foreigners about the contributions of Muslims in Europe, but surely we need this book in Britain, in schools. And I gave the example that, look, I went to the best school in Liverpool, and I did history right through to A-level, and never once did I hear anything about Muslim Spain, about Cordoba. Now I said, I'm not saying that the English curriculum should be about Pakistani history. At the end of the day, we all know how important it was to know what the Tudors had for breakfast. That's fair enough. We can carry on with that. But this was European history, and it wasn't just 10-20 years. It was centuries of Muslim presence, and it wasn't just presence. It was actually having the three faith communities working together for the benefit of society.
In a way that didn't happen anywhere else.
In a way that
and impacted us.
Impacted us. And there's actual, you can, I remember there was a documentary on the BBC a few years ago about these particular forceps that were used during childbirth. And the guy was saying we still use them today. And they were invented in Cordoba under the Muslims, 1,000 years ago. So it does very much still impact us today, and yet that wasn't deemed worthy.
Well, advances in mathematics would be enough.
Nowadays we're talking about social media and the algorithm. Where does the word algorithm come from? That it's named after the Muslim guy who came up with the idea. And so why? And again, it's important to get this through to young people, because otherwise they get this diet of Muslims are extremists, they've never done anything good, they can't park the cars properly, it's negative. Whereas if you taught them that actually, the word algebra, algorithms, science, and some people say the Renaissance itself had Muslim roots. If you explain it to them in that way, they will have a different view of Muslims.
The rediscovery of classical civilization in Europe was via the Arabic and Muslim influence.
And but I think the impact is on not just the non-Muslim kids. The impact's also on the Muslim kids, because the Muslim kids are taking in the same social media, nonsense, and they're also being brought up to believe that Muslims have never contributed anything useful, and so they're in schools in certain deprived towns, and they're growing up thinking, well, what are we ever going to achieve?
And then they fall victim to the gang thing. You're gonna have to come back, Zia, because we're just like we could go on for another hour, but we've reached the end of this podcast.
Halfway down the question.
It's been absolutely fantastic having you on. It's been a conversation, and we need, just as we've said, we need more of these conversations, and I'm sure we'll have another one in a few months.
More than happy to.
Great to see you again, and
Yeah.
thanks
Thank you
for
very much
coming on.
indeed.
Thank you.
Thank you.